Yeah, totally by accident. So yeah, should we start on that note? So hi everyone, welcome to the final event and first proper talk, I suppose. Everything else has been kind of a bit more workshoppy. And I suppose it's not really a proper talk either. We're planning on having a conversation, so that the intention is that everyone gets involved, so audience included. So any of the questions that we ask, we kind of want to involve you guys as well and see what your responses are. But before we get into it, I wanted to, we, School Cyborg, wanted to thank Neon Festival of Digital Arts for having us up here, for supporting us and giving us all the guidance over the last 6 months. It's been really, really great experience, and we've learned an incredible amount of things and like what it means to create an event and curate an event, and how we've ended up thinking so much more deeply about the content and the work that you guys do, and how we can contribute to that and be a small part of it. So thank you very much for having us as part of your project and your festival. I'd also like to thank Kathryn Rattray for letting us take over her space for this last couple of days, and your help over the weeks running up to this weekend. It's I've really appreciated your support, and it's just been such a wonderful experience to be up here and also be able to like have something outside of London and be in person and meet and talk with everybody.
You're so welcome.
Don't go home. Stay. I would also like to thank our delightful tutor, Dr. Lee Weinberg, who's been an incredible part of our project. Again, another guiding light in this whole experience. So thank you very much for everything.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And finally, thank you to Shannon for being part of this project as well over like this last 6 months. We contacted you quite like earlier on in the summer, I think now, isn't it? And and it's nice to be finally at this point where we've got audience online and in person. So without further ado, I suppose we'll start. Carlo, do you want to carry on?
Before we dig into the conversation with Shannon, I would like to introduce our guests, both in person and online. Hello, everybody, to our School of Cyborg, which is the name of this weekend, or of this machine, or of this project. See, they overlap quite a bit. We chose this name for a few reasons. It is a school. It means that we experimented on ourselves as curators. We experimented with those 2 workshops that we had yesterday. We had learned, maybe somebody has expanded their knowledge, it's happy. Maybe somebody else has tested or has questioned what was known before. And we tried to see different perspectives on AI, visual and digital art, and today we will see some new approaches or some interesting questions around identity and our digital presence, and how the cyborg can evolve into that. And then again, the cyborg is a very complex concept. Actually, it's on the one hand it's pretty easily definable. On the other hand, it's very open to discussion. We can say that the cyborg is this hybrid between human and machine, but it's not only that. Probably it's not a satisfactory definition in that sense. Of course, the cyborg has a great, let's say, presence in pop culture, from movies, cartoons, cinema. The astronaut itself as the great image of the 60s, of the 70s, was a cyborg itself, was one of the main references that built this imaginary. But on the other hand, the cyborg has always been, since Donna Haraway's important, fundamental, I would say, text, the Cyborg Manifesto, it has been a figure that has engaged with feminist and queer thought in a very, very complex manner. Donna Haraway defines the cyborg as something that goes beyond the gender, that goes somehow that has no need of reproduction, or it has a different need of reproduction than the one that we have, and therefore questions the gender roles. If I don't need to reproduce anymore, why do I need a gender? Do I need a gender? That's the question that the author poses through her also ironic, also utopian description of this machine human, because of in Donna Haraway is the machine to be overwhelming. On the other hand, we have other theorists that say no, actually, it's just a matter of body, just an enhancement of our human possibilities. And after all, maybe we're all cyborgs. Is it true? Is it not true? Well, depends. According to the position you decide to acquire. And so the school of cyborg, we learn to become cyborg because this is the tendency that we have seen, that we are slowly or fastly becoming cyborg altogether in our contemporary culture. So we are trying to address through this program, even though very shortly, maybe too shortly, on the issues related to gaps to access the technologies that make us a cyborg. So we have explored the gaps with AI yesterday morning, with all the relation with bias, how biased are the programmings of this AI, how do white male fueled by caffeine hipster programmers of AI somehow infect or pollute an AI. And yesterday afternoon we have talked about the representation of women in digital art, both in terms of what is represented and how is the women artist in digital art working today. So how do they access? And today we're talking about cyborg, and we're trying to see if the cyborg has a queer potential somehow. And to begin with, we're quoting Kathryn Hayes, which is a very fundamental, again, scholar and writer in cyber culture, that describes the cyborg as something that violates the human-machine distinction, replaces cognition with neural feedback, and challenges the human-animal difference. And that's where probably the queer potential of a cyborg can be found. And now, heading to Frankie to introduce our wonderful guest.
Thanks, Carlo. So we're going to now just give a little bit of a kind of breakdown of Shannon's work. Shannon is a professor of English and a director of film studies at State University of New York at Fredonia, teaching literature, film, mythology, religion, queer theory, and pop culture, and is also currently in the middle of writing a book on non-mainstream religions, spiritual tourism, pop culture, and paganism in Jazz Age America. And I suppose one of the questions that we probably want to first address is why we connected with you in the first place. So for those of you that don't know about Neon's Digital Art Festival, it's based on this text called Wired Women, and it's a collective, it's a book of collective essays. And Shannon features in the book with her text Coming Apart at the Seams, Sex, Text in the Virtual Body, which explores gender identity and identity exploration in the virtual spaces, and the relationships that are generated in that space. And it all comes from this idea of, they come from text-based games and how the communities are built in these places, which were known as MUDs and MUs, which MUDs stand for multi-user dungeons, and MUs are multi-user dungeons that are object-orientated. And these spaces are where kind of fantastical spaces that are where the user engages on these online platforms that are purely text-based. So you're using your imagination to create these identities, and people develop relationships and interact with each other. one of the things that we wanted to address was why we thought that the text was relevant today. And for us, it was this idea of how we address identity and freedom of expression online. As Carlo already mentioned, we talked about Donna Haraway and how like the cyborg is a kind of disassembled and reassembled postmodern collective and personal self. And the cyborg is a creature in a post-gendered world. And I'd like to read a little bit about how Shannon's interpreted this quote from Donna Haraway. It's the figure of the cyborg, part human, part machine, has become a significant icon of this new computer-generated reality because technology has become so much a part of everyday life. Feminist theorist Donna Haraway concludes that we are all cyborgs, gleeful cyborgs, the illegitimate offspring of the founding fathers of military and cybernetic research, fulfilling one of childhood's most avid and most forbidden wishes, are out of playing on the highway that their fathers built. In a variety of makeshift sprawling encampments alongside the highway, they discover other shapeshifters, gaze into other eyes, glowing, opaque, and shining phosphor bright. It's a really, really beautiful way of kind of understanding how we move around these virtual spaces and how we connect with different people. What we also wanted to kind of mention before we go much further into this conversation, we said women quite a lot in the last like 10-15 minutes, but we wanted to just echo what Neon's own statement has been in regards to how we define women. And this is a statement that is inclusive of trans and intersex women, non-binary and gender fluid people. So we consider this term women to be a very openly explored word. So I just want to do a little bit of handing over to Shannon. Is there anything I got wrong? Is there any corrections you'd like to make?
No. No, and thank you for that. Thank you, Frankie and Carlo and School of Cyborg for inviting me here. And it's been really enjoyable for me. I was really happy you contacted me and asked me to think about work I'd done quite a while ago, which it's been almost 30 years now. But also because I've retained an interest in online culture. And it's been really interesting to be asked to consider not only something I'd worked on in the past, but also where we've come in nearly 30 years in terms of internet culture, but also gender and genderedness, because those topics really interest me. And I think that culture has come a long way in some very real ways, but I'm excited about the opportunity to reconsider ideas about embodiment and engenderment, not just online, but also life in general. And I still think the cyborg is a very lively figure for doing that. Maybe to expand, open, play with conversation. And I've also enjoyed our sessions because it's just been really interesting to engage in a playful kind of way with people interested in the same things. But there seems to be some tension and some very interesting tension around the definition of cyborg. And more specifically, are we becoming cyborg somehow? Is there like a vanishing point of humanity? Or are we already cyborg? And I think that's a really interesting question and a crucial question. As I interpreted Haraway then, and I think I still do, I think it's important to register that it's essentially non-binary. Now, there's an oxymoron for you, but we're still accustomed to thinking, I think, in essential binaries. It's so deeply wired into our culture, male, female, machine, human. And so one of the questions we've been playing with and around is there some departure point? Is there some place we can retreat from cyborgness? But I'd like to consider the question and the concept that we're always already cyborg, that the work in the 90s, and why one of the questions I asked was, why the 90s? Why now? Since there's been so much time. But one of Haraway's interventions into a lot of feminist conversations and questions of socialism that were so important then is binaries, the nature culture binary, which defined second wave feminism back then, but also capitalism, socialism, the idea that somehow there was an either or, there was some escape from the condition of capitalism, for example, or some escape from the machine. And I found Haraway and also Michel Foucault really exciting. What if we are already there? What if this is us? And the words and the language we have now that we didn't have then, which I'm excited about, is what I was trying to define in my work, is what it means to be non-binary. Non-binary gender, genderqueer, not male or male pretending to be female, or female with somehow a male inside, or acting male online when I'm really actually female. But the condition and state of non-binariness, of a dissolution, or a permeability, not dissolution, but permeability and playful permeability between gendered identity, but also the difference between human and machine. And in Haraway's later work, the difference between human and animal, which is another persistent binary. And that excites me and interests me very much. We didn't at the time, and I was trying to describe gender queerness, what it really felt like to be a person who was truly genderqueer, both male and female, or fluidly male and female. And we have that vocabulary now that we didn't then, but it was a state I was very interested in describing, and I was so attracted to Haraway at the time, because to be asked to consider ourselves as already cyborg is empowering in an entirely different way, because rather than trying to escape something or get away with or get away from something and fight against it, what if this power and this fluidity is already ours? And to me, that was a very powerful metaphor, and still is. And the idea of a non-binary self, a queer self, is also very powerful, and I think very important to consider.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. What we'll do next is we'll start these the questions. So just to describe the format of the way the next 40 minutes or so is going to run, we're going to have a series of 5 questions, and what we've done is to kind of develop this kind of idea of the conversation, is that we're going to present 3 questions to Shannon, but in between each question, Shannon's also going to present questions to us. And what we'd like to do is also, after each of these questions, put it out into the audience, so see if there's any responses, any thoughts that we'd like to open up and investigate. Do you want to jump in?
For those online, we invite you to take a look at the all the policy that we just sent through the chat. You have received probably also in the email, just to be sure that everything's clear on the code of conduct. We have an online moderator, which will gather your comments and eventually will give you the faculty to speech, so that we don't echo too much with the room. So we would like all those online to engage as well in the most fruitful way possible, if they desire.
Yeah. So we're going to start with an audience question, and we want to just throw out some ideas. If anyone online, just type them in the chat box. And what we're going to do is we're going to collect all of these answers. Again, you don't have to share them if you don't want to. There's a point of reference, so you can return. We're going to return to some of these questions later on. But as you'll see behind me, we've got our 3 colours. We're going to stick all of the responses on the wall, or you can keep them to yourselves. And and then we'll have a look and have a little think about it later on. So the first question I want to give to the audience and Shannon as well, and us to think about ourselves, is how do we present ourselves online? Maybe if you're not quite sure, if you've got social media, have a look at your little bios, or if you do have a virtual identity or how you present yourself online is outside of social media. What is that character or person or identity? How do you see yourself online in any shape or form? And you just like write it down, think about it, don't or put it kind of somewhere. For example, I'll share my own virtual identity. It's a fantasy identity where I play games with my housemates, and it's a little character. She's a dwarf, got red hair, long red hair, and she's called Max Fireblood, and she is a total fantasy character, and I love her dearly and played her so many times online and offline RPG games, and she's my little character, and I love her. And we have lots of adventures, and so that's my little person, and it is a fantasy-based thing, and I don't role play online in a sense of like it's somewhere I always go and visit. It's not like a regular thing, but it's one of those places where I find I play games with friends, and we have these fantastical adventures. But it's not a character that I live through my life all the time. It's not part of my identity as such, but it's someone that I've created from my own from my heart, I suppose. So have a think about it. How do you think about does a cyborg come in there at all? Have a think about what these ideas. So I'll give everyone should we say we'll give 2 minutes to think about it? Don't worry about the quiet. It's a nice time to have a little reflection, and then we'll come back. So a couple of minutes to have a think about it.
If you have already, if you want to share on that.
So I have an article here. He's on
The blue part. Okay, thank you. If anybody in the room wants to share or to just place their post-its, if anybody online wants to share their thoughts, just you can raise your hand, type in a message, and we will be glad to add you to our wonderful post-it collection now or when we discuss in a minute with Shannon, maybe some thoughts around this first question arise. Yeah, please.
I think for me personally, I treat my presence online, kind of the way I interact with technology, as an extension of myself, not as a kind of like an alter ego or something. and especially kind of considering myself a non-binary person. I think it's a little bit easier to be non-binary, for example, online, just because I don't have a body in a way. People don't see my body. If I tell them that I'm non-binary and use they, them pronouns, it's kind of just happens most of the time. Meanwhile, in real life, when I interact with people and kind of having my body out there, it's kind of much more often people lean to the interpretation of me as feminine in a binary way.
Yeah, that's also the richness of this textual dimension that we've mentioned before, the mood and the math. So through text, it's a different way of engaging with the lack of image. Actually, is a strong point of the discussion that we arrived as well.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that as well. Appreciate it. Anyone else want to add any more things to it, or should we move on? Or you guys are writing?
I think it's quite difficult for me I hadn't thought about any of this at all, so it's all a bit new. But I just had this one thing, but it's I don't know if it's even connected, but I generally present fairly sort of straightforward in that sense of the job I do, and online I'm just but I do play Words with Friends, that game Words with Friends, and I love it. But I've found that this is the only thing that came out of the question, which might not be quite appropriate, but I've made a name for myself, which is MR Don't Chat. MR Don't Chat for my name, because I hate people chatting. And then if I don't chat, they just start a game and then they just disappear because I don't chat. So, but nobody listens to it. So it really annoys me. I've got a name, MR Don't Chat, and then they all chat, and then the game halfway through. It pisses me right off.
Thank you very much. For example, another issue is the one of filtering the flux of information. I'm thinking of, for example, of Instagram, that permits you to have a list of people that you show something, a list of people that you show something else. So also this fluidity of that if identity is given in relation, this fluidity of I talk to one group or to another, but through the same platform, through the same means of communication. Or even I create a restricted account, which is something that is more and more experimented probably in our generation more than others, to control more and more the narrowness of this information flux through the network. So this is another strategy. So thank you very much for having shared your thoughts with us. Thank you online if you will have something to say, or please again raise your hands, write your questions. We're here for you as well. So Shannon, let's start. We have our engines already quite hot. We have everybody at a certain point, almost everybody, have decided to have an online identity. It means that we share some parts of ourselves, being their images, time, energy, money, on the internet, because a PayPal account is still an identity online. So, in your opinion, yes, it is important to have an online identity, or it's just somewhat a burden or something to get. And when we have more than one identity, what happens?
We were chatting about some of this in our last session, and I was thinking about the fact that we're here now, and the question would have been a very different question a year ago. We probably wouldn't have met, or not as easily, but also COVID and the pandemic has forced us all inside. And I used to, for example, hate video chat. I refused to, which might be surprising since I've been online for a very long time, but I refused to have my wedding videoed, and I can barely stand photographs, and I wouldn't even speak to my family. But the pandemic has really required, at least for many professionals, an online presence that wasn't required before. More or less unscripted. So I've had to learn, for example, to teach students online. It's very curious and strange to be speaking to you from my actual home when most people, one invites friends into one's home occasionally and usually not into my office. And yet, hello, everybody, here's the world. And then I was thinking about the objects I have and what objects I should display, which of my strange little things might I don't know, make people think things. But that's been a consideration, is how to frame one's self and home and professional self during the pandemic for my students, for an audience in Scotland, which is wonderful. That's where we are now, and it's a very interesting moment. There's certainly the question of accessibility and privilege that has been one of the larger themes of the Neon Festival as well. Who gets to be online? Who has access? Who doesn't? And what are the purposes? Purposes, but also accessibility. I live in an area with fairly good internet, and I can afford good internet, a good speaker, good video. It's part of my job, and it's encouraged, and I've had very little training on how to do it, but I've learned pretty quickly. But I don't know about more than one identity anymore. Back when I started in the 90s, nobody was on the internet except engineers and a few intellectuals. I was actually part of the first wave of people with humanities backgrounds, and I used to really tussle with engineers about just basic ways of being human and what that meant, ways of treating people. That you can't solve every problem with technology. There's human beings here. And particularly on Lambda Mu, which was a social space, not a role-playing game per se. We were inventing our own society while we were inventing cells and ways of interaction, and human issues come up. Like, famously, human issues come up. There are jerks, there are trolls, there are people who really, really like to jerk people around for fun. That exists then and now. I don't think we handled it very well. But I think what I always insisted then, and what people poorly understood then, is that yourself online isn't somehow magically different from yourself in the real world. People would act in certain ways and say, well, I don't act that way. I don't act that way in real life, just here, because you people aren't real. I was like, yes, we are real. We might present different aspects of ourselves professionally. One of the jokes we were telling is, we don't bring our role-playing game selves, our Dungeons and Dragons selves onto LinkedIn, although that would be very entertaining. So certainly we present a professional facet of ourselves, or I'm much more casual with my friends. But we're real, and there's not a real or an unreal self that's being presented. And I think, too, a thing I was thinking when I was listening to people's responses is, it was really, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, but I completely agree about, as a non-binary person, that's part of being online for me, is I'm mostly textual. I write, and my writing isn't gendered. People have been surprised to meet me, but in real life, I'm going around with this very visibly female body, and people behave accordingly. But some people also, and your description, Frankie, was of an image, like a self that is primarily an icon of yourself. And that's different too. Lambda Mu was an entirely textual space that existed before graphic interfaces. And things like Instagram obviously are much more visually heavy. And I think that's different too. Are you more a textual person or more a visual person? Are you more comfortable with yourself as an image, as a carefully curated brand in an image space? Or is there room for a more writerly self as well, or both? And I think that internet today and being present online today requires much more crafting and honing of one's image. And also, I think branding to a certain extent. It's a little bit hard to be online these days without being a brand. And I think that's changed somewhat.
Indeed, there is at least a part of the identity that needs to be performed. We're thinking of Judith Butler's idea of performative gender.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat resonates with what you just said, especially when speaking with graphic interface and contemporary online identity that passed I wouldn't say 90%, but a great amount of data is to the others is given through graphic solutions. So there is this idea of, let's say, preparing oneself to take a picture, editing, which are theatrically speaking the same actions that somehow the performative of Judith Butler say you have to build something around that, some attention, some narrative to that takes care of your image. Yesterday we were speaking about giving a mythology, a background story to an AI. So this performative nature of our online identity is something that's still to be explored. We know about performative activism. We know about the brand building stories around themselves. But what happens with queer identities or queer individuals? That is still a place that needs to be covered, probably.
I wondered if I were to throw the kind of this whole discussion out into the audience, if anyone had anything to contribute online or offline in real life. Does anyone have any thoughts based on what we just talked about?
That's exactly what's happened to me with the gallery. So for a long time I hid behind different pseudonyms. The first one was Twisted Flax, and then I hid around, that was for photography, and then Studio 11 before I could put my name to it, because I wasn't confident with anything that I was giving out online. And then when I started to put my name to it, I had to build an identity around it to make me be perceived by other people as a trustworthy brand. So I started branding myself under this identity. And it actually prevents me putting stuff out on my Instagram page, because if it's not up to the highest standard, then I can't put it out, because then I start to think, well, what will people say? Who will judge me without focus?
Yeah.
You know, I'm judging myself actually, because it's out of focus, you know? So that's exactly what's happened to me, is that I'm starting to create something that is 100% me, but a very polished version of the real chaotic version that I am, you know?
Can I ask, kind of 30 years ago, as obviously there's a lot changed, and the idea of the feminist cyborg in the 21st century is very different to what it was 30 years ago. I still think there's a complexity in that kind of accepting that people are non-binary, whether that's an oxymoron or not, or like we are multifaceted as humans. And I think that maybe is actually difficult to comprehend and sometimes scary. And I think now that we're online, that multifacetedness is much more clear. And do you think that's contributing to the backlash to non-binary? Like people, I find that people are now actually, I want a simple explanation. You're either male or female, and that's all I need to know. Whereas now it's that multifaceted, and I think the actual technology, the internet, has been able to give us that. Do you think that's kind of, I mean, it's going to fracture even more. So do you think that's going to get even more problematic?
So there's a couple of dimensions, I think. there's the increased visibility of non-binary persons and trans persons politically, for example, in a way that we were always around.
Yeah.
But it's become, particularly in the past few years, and certainly here in the States, and I think there too, and particularly around trans people, right? Which there's a great deal of discussion around that because there's a lot more trans visibility and non-binary visibility, and people using non-binary pronouns, for example, in a way that there weren't. And with that visibility, I think you're saying comes backlash, which is also the case because it's become part of public discourse in a way that's been very strategically misunderstood, I think, by the political right, but it might be a somewhat difficult concept even for ordinary, possibly sympathetic people. So, yeah, I think these things are there, and in the public consciousness and in public discourse in ways that are problematic. It was in some ways easier to be queer in the 90s, even though we didn't have words for it because there wasn't quite so much visibility.
Mm.
But it's certainly a point of political tension and maybe even a little more dangerous because of the backlash. And I'm not sure what to do about that.
Mm.
But certainly, I think increased visibility and the fact that we are here, we exist, is crucial. And I think that trans people, genderqueer people, non-binary people are at the cultural moment that gays and lesbians were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's now much more mainstream. I'm hoping anyway.
Mm. Yeah, let's hope so.
Thank you.
Can I share a thought?
Of course.
So, in my observation, when you asked, like, how do you represent ourselves? How do we represent ourselves online? It's quite clear that online representation really depends on the platform. As we said, we're not going to put ourselves as dragons in LinkedIn, and that identity becomes like a forge between the media's intention for the platform and what they want us to perform within their platform, which obviously plays to their financial interest, and the kind of way that we want to represent ourselves. I don't think that it is significantly different from what it was before. I think that if you think about ourselves, even before online culture existed, we always were a very complex set of identities, and we don't act the same way with our friends and our family and in work. And we don't wear the same things, we don't wear the same makeup, jewelry to the pub, and when we go to, I don't know, a funeral. So there are different facets of our identity that are constantly there, but maybe one of the things that online culture had created is this kind of breaking of the facade, because and accentuating actually those different facets of self and pointing out to the illusion of a unified self, as if we are all just a unified self or identity is one thing rather than a multiplicity of eyes that kind of live and coexist within this body machine. And I think that this is what, when I go online, this is what happens to me. I kind of understand much better how different facets of my own identity are also shaped by external circumstances, and how identity is fluid in relationship to who I am in contact with and what is the purpose of that communication. And I think that within the Web 2.0 logic, there is one book that I really like, I would recommend. It's called The Protein State Itself. It's a book by Robert J. Lifton. He speaks about, it's also a book that was written quite a while ago, I think about 30 years ago, but also observing what is happening in social networks. And within social networks, the let's say the phenomenon of the filter bubble, which we didn't speak about in recent days, really creates, because on the one hand, there is this accentuation of different identities that live within us. And on the other hand, there is these echo chambers that are created within social networks. So we are actually less exposed to people who are outside of our definition of identity. And we tend to like or dislike things in relationship to whether we agree with them or not, which kind of creates those bubbles of identity. And for Robert J. Lifton, he writes about how this actually accentuates political polarization. So he speaks about, on the one hand, fluid or maybe non-binary identity. Maybe we can relate those two things as being flexible, like a flexible self or a protein self, a self that is constantly changing in relationship to circumstances. That's one result of online and web communication. But the other result of online web communication is actually much more stiffer and rigid identity structures that are conceived from those kind of echo chambers that constantly reinforce our understanding and conditionings about ourselves. So I think that maybe I just wanted to reflect on that these kind of conflict between rigid identity and fluid identity creates a lot of tension, political tension, that is accentuated also in recent events, I believe, and recent political polarization that we can see in many Western societies, or societies that are connected to online resources. So I don't know, I just thought that it might be interesting to think about that also in that wider notion of what is the advantage of being fluid or the advantage of being non-binary for the health of society as a whole.
Thank you.
Moving beyond identity politics.
Thank you. Just a little note, Shannon, when we're talking in the room, would you mind, we've muted you at the minute, but when we're talking in the room, would you mind muting your mic, because we're getting a little bit of an audio loop from your system. So you're muted at the moment, so we can't hear you. But I suppose this is a good time to move on to your question, Shannon. Would you like to present it, or? Oh, we can't hear you, Shannon. You need to unmute yourself.
All right.
Yes.
I just turned into a giant me to let me return to the gallery view. There, that's better. Oh, no, what was the question?
Okay, we've got to hear. So what was it about that particular moment in the 90s that still seems relevant for scholars, or maybe people negotiating the internet now? That's the question. Is there anything you want to expand on that question at all?
Maybe, because it's when you contacted me and asked me to told you that you read this essay, it's like, that's nice. I really hadn't thought about these things in nearly 30 years. My scholarship took quite a different direction for several reasons. And so much has happened in 30 years. And also as a professor, I'm always really concerned with the idea of current relevance. I did my graduate work in the 1990s, and when one gets into a career, I don't know if I've kept up as much with theoretical trends. Maybe I try to. So I'm happy to hear that some of this is still relevant to another generation, but maybe how do you read that moment in the 90s? How do you see it from your perspective as younger people? And does it seem hopelessly retro or relevant to today?
No, I think I can only speak personally, but like reading your text, there was because I was a teenager in 2000. I was 13 in 2000, so I saw a lot of like change from kind of text-based chat and how it moved through to like kind of more interactive online websites. So such a huge change in like the way we interact as a teenager online, going through MSN chat and like having pen pals with people in like Houston, in Texas, like having suddenly like being connected with so many people, and I thought the Landamu and these the text-based communities that you talk about was something I'd never really considered. And I think to a certain extent, I think I was a part of it when I was a teenager. I just hadn't really connected at that, like in that place that I was involved in it. And so it was interesting to kind of see from somebody else's perspective what was going on in the kind of in the late 90s and especially into the 2000s, how things changed. And then obviously seeing like how like social media became a thing, and we went into MySpace and all of forums have been a thing for such a long time, and there's still like music-based forums that's still incredibly like popular, particularly in the UK anyway. I don't know about the rest of the world. But yeah, it's kind of I found it really interesting in how to learn how beneficial it was for different communities, these text-based experiences, and trying to understand like where everybody sits in the world, and especially on a kind of in this online space that's so malleable. It was, yeah, I just found it really fascinating that how these relationships are built and how we communicate with each other. Yeah, so I think there was like this this place of like adventure and exploration. There was this kind of sense of I think there's a kind of, there's a possibility, there's the potential there in like the online sphere, and how reading how your interviews kind of documented how people had like benefit, how those spaces had impacted their lives and their relationships had formed or been kind of fallen apart, and how people understood themselves in those spaces and remade their identities. It was really, I found it really fascinating to kind of understand, to try and understand what was going on at that point, even though my own perspective at that time was obviously very young. Yeah, that's how I say it.
I think that.
Can I pitch in?
Yeah.
Please.
I just want to say, hi, Kathryn, I'm a really big fan of your work. And I actually referenced your essay on wild women on my dissertation last year. So I definitely feel like it's still very relevant in different theoretical discussions. And there's a quote, I really apologize, I can't remember if it's in your essay or another one in the book, but there's a quote that really stuck with me in Wild Women, where we really didn't have the terminology for like trans and non-binary people. And there's a description of feminism as being not necessarily for women, but for anybody who resists the patriarchy and patriarchal gender roles. And I just really love that as a concept. And I feel like as a non-binary person, there's a lot of good things about the discourse having moved on, and there's also kind of things that we could learn from the fluidity of the 90s as well. And I mean, I out myself as a massive nerd, but I around like a similar time period as Frankie, I used to run a forum, and all my friends just kind of happened to be queer and never really had the words for non-binary and queer and that sort of thing. But when we described ourselves, because we didn't send photos, we all, having like met them all in person now, we all described ourselves as we were then. So it wasn't an alternative, nobody was like, I'm 6 foot and blonde and gorgeous or whatever. It wasn't, or whatever. It wasn't an alternative. It was, they were describing themselves. So I think there's a possibility for online identities to not necessarily be an escape from yourself, but sort of to bring yourself into a space where you are accepted if you're not accepted in real life.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I may just kind of add to what you said. My experience with internet is happening a little bit later because it's in the early 2000s. But I remember I was around 13, kind of struggling with my identity, and feeling like I really, really don't like myself, but I'm really not sure why. And also that thinking that it's because of my looks, because of my weight, etc. And then kind of just kind of stumbling upon the term non-binary somewhere online. Everything just really clicked. I was like, yeah, that's it. And then for the next few years, weirdly enough, it's been kind of trying and worrying about fitting into the term of non-binary, in the gender sense of how should I dress, do my hair, etc. Yes, makeup, no makeup, blah blah blah. And thankfully, kind of reaching, going past teenagers, slowly going into adulthood, I started really feeling like it doesn't matter to me, and I kind of refuse to define myself through my physicality, and I'm trying to, to the best of my ability, apply it both online and in real life, and kind of this is, as you said, this kind of it doesn't matter whether how tall are you, blonde, brunette, whatever. It's kind of finding that space, not necessarily online only, where you feel comfortable with yourself, whatever it is. And in that sense, I would say that kind of what you Shannon said, that queer and non-binary is just the non-fitting one.
I had it's funny because I had the exact same thing. I didn't use the word non-binary for myself until very recently, because I think it's a very specific thing. It used to be that I feel like it came from a space where it was meant to be I guess a rejection of the gender binary, and now it's become almost like a third type of identity. And I notice, and this is not necessarily a negative thing by any sense, but I notice a lot of kind of Gen Z, the younger generation today. There's even positive jokes that are internal to the community. They joke about looking like a they them, which I love. I think it's fantastic that there is that visual identity, but I don't know, maybe it's because I'm older or whatever, but there wasn't that trend. There wasn't looking like a they them when I was younger. We just kind of were. So there was a real duality where it was we didn't have the words, we didn't know this was normal, and that was very distressing. But there also wasn't a trend that we felt we had to look a certain way in order to be non-binary or to be trans or whatever. So
it can be
interesting.
Yeah, it's that trend can be really constraining and anxiety inducing, because you kind of read about what non-binary is, just kind of not fitting into a description, but then you see the trend online of the they thems kind of wearing oversized hoodies and beanies, etc. And you start thinking, is that what I should like? But I don't feel comfortable like that. So it's kind of good to see that it's becoming more popular, as in widely accepted, that more people are coming out and try to feel comfortable with themselves, but also the way it's presented online, it has its ups and downs.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I think there is a resonance of hope of that period. Somewhat that everything was open, of possibilities, of perspectives to adopt. I don't know. It was almost dying, because maybe it was the birth of the commercial internet. But the idea of the whole art catalog, of that wholeness, of that you can be together a pirate and a carpenter, and you came up with a hacker and whatever. So this possibility, the openness, I think that's still relevant today, because we are at a certain, somehow similar point with AI, with embodiment of technologies, with a real cyborg, physical cyborg. It's possible. we have it under our hands, and seeing how the history of the internet, which was the big thing, has developed, maybe can help us thinking about possible futures of this. We propose to take a little break. I'm sorry, VA just joined for the millionth time, but we are taking a 5 minutes break because we have been discussing a lot. Maybe we also need to ventilate a bit the space here, and we're maybe back in 5, 6, 10 past. I don't know what time is it at yours.
It's 11:05 here, so a 5-minute break is
Let's take 5 and we will be
Kathryn,
back.
I'm
We
going
will
to
play some
nip
music in the
off.
meantime.
I've
If you
got
don't
to
mind.
take the dance
Thank
with
you.
my dad. So.
You send an email, an emoji or something from online to see. Oh, Ashley would like to intervene. Ashley,
I think I'm gonna just maybe just trying to
oh,
find the emoji.
find the emoji. Okay.
It's in the same space as raising a hand, which isn't very helpful if you're trying. Okay, so as we've only got 45 minutes left of Shannon's time, we should get straight back into it again. So yeah, we're now on our third question. It's probably quite as all the questions have been quite big, and I wondered if at what point does having a virtual identity make us a cyborg? Is there something in our identity or body that the virtual identity or cyborg life can't reach? So some scholars like Manfred Kleins have said that gender is something that the cyborg can't reach at all. But we wondered when engaging with your text if it could be emotions. When real emotions are involved, how do we navigate online relationships through virtual identities?
the question is phrased, and I've been thinking about this a lot. Seems oddly binary. And it's sort of like cyborg is this encroaching thing that's going to get your humanity. And I don't think that's how it works. I think this is so crucial. Like, humanity is not the sacrosanct thing that's threatened on all sides by this otherness of machine or animal. We're always part of other things. We're always part of technology. We're technology users, but there is not a thing that is us that is somehow to be kept safe. And one of the things when we were chatting, and I don't know if you guys have seen Westworld, which is an HBO show, but in HBO, like Blade Runner, the basic premise is that these manufactured entities are evolving into consciousness. But that consciousness means self-awareness. They're already capable of emotions. They're already capable of pain, and they're being tortured by humans who are completely sociopathic. So certainly I don't think the possession or absence of emotions is a question. But I think a more strategic question is, how do we empower ourselves? How is cyborg identity, the incorporation of the human and the machine, the permeability of those boundaries, how is that empowering? Rather than how do we keep humanity safe somehow, or emotion non-emotionless, because humans are sociopathic fucks, really. And what was that line? Our machines have become lively and we ourselves are frighteningly inert. I think that's from the Cyborg Manifesto. But rather, how is this a space of power for us? And how do how do we use machines? How do we be machine it in ways that make space for community, make space for ourselves, make space for other people? How do we build communities online of like-minded people? And somebody said earlier about the silos and hardening of oppositions, which I think is quite a problem and quite true. So yeah, I think the idea of a separation between a cyborg and a human self is kind of a very unhelpful binary. But such a familiar one. And certainly we bring our emotions with us. Obviously, that if anything is a lot of a problem with online discourse is just it's like gigantic rage buddies, and whoever talks the loudest and yells the most somehow wins the attention. But no, I mean, we're all of those things. This is where many of us live now. And I think we may as well use cyborg identity and our incorporation with the machine world and the digital world to make things better, to create connection and establish connection, which is also, I think, what we're doing. But also to take the space seriously as a space in terms of the negative and harmful tendencies as well.
Can I ask, how do we do that in the face of the metaverse?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last word. In the face of
the metaverse.
Oh, the metaverse. You know, wow. And become deific. No, I'm not sure. It all seems so vast, doesn't it? Like it's a little weightless and boundaryless. And I think if anything, where we are now with online spaces is there's not a lot of boundary or a lot of edge or a lot of separation between it's, and my students, for example, don't know what information is correct and what is, there's a complete inability to distinguish bad from good information, for example. And it's led to this odd moral relativism that I keep yelling at them about, because there's just a sea of information and misinformation, and it sounds and it looks the same to them because it all, and this is the big negative effect, it all carries equal weight essentially. And or the more aggressive and persistent somehow outweighs the quieter and the more methodical. I'm not sure how to fix these larger problems, except some of the people I've been talking to about these questions are so all about empathy. And I think one of the ways we make space and make things better is to go into this empathically, not this is you guys aren't real somehow, but to feel more and to feel more connected and to recognize each other's essential humanity and just be as nice as possible. And I know that sounds cheesy, but I think it's what we have, honestly.
It confuses me immensely when you say, like, I totally agree. The metaverse is, it comes with no, it, you know, as a product, it has no, it has nothing. It's got nothing to offer. It's there's nothing new. There's no, but it comes with such this back end weighted, well-trodden patriarchal capitalism that it's just, it's inevitable that it's just going to penetrate everything, and it's so disheartening to kind of not be able to stop it. You know, and where do our kind of motivations and ethics and, you know, get that power from? I you know, I still kind of struggle with it immensely. I felt sick when I watched the video. I physically felt ill. But yeah, and it's coming. And what we do is it gives much, I don't know, it just comes with a more complex and more interesting environment, knowledge, everything. Whereas this metaverse comes with nothing. It's yeah. Sorry to be. How do we stop it?
You want an answer?
Yes.
Somebody answer her.
We have a comment from Amy online. She said, I would love to see a cyborg as implementation of technology, daily life, and culture that's actually useful for everyday people. But I'm terrified by the tech billionaires who are pushing AI and similar tech for capitalist colonial purpose right now.
Oh yeah.
I have a question for Shannon. You just talked about how we can use virtual identity to empowering ourselves. So how do you consider the overpowerness that our virtual identity gave us in the digital space?
There's a little bit fuzzy audio. Would you mind typing the question in chat?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
In the meantime, we have another comment by Alison. She was asking what the video was done referring to. I think you were referring to the announcement that 1 or 2 weeks ago was held by Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Yes.
In that famous house on the lake with this fancy stuff. And yeah, that's maybe we'll share the link in a minute.
I don't know.
I don't want to.
For those who can't see Donna's face in the description of Mark Zuckerberg's video, was incredibly pained.
But I mean, it's just the recreation of early forums with just some fancy glitter on it. You know, we've been there and done that, and we don't need Mark Zuckerberg. We don't need him in there. I'm just so angry that we've let him in.
Okay, this is the question by Kathryn. It's arrived on a comment. How do you think the overpowerfulness that our virtual identity gives us, so somewhat it goes beyond our boundaries, our regular power, is it right?
Yes, thank you.
Our possibilities,
Yeah.
say it like that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about that. And yeah, Zuckerberg and the big gigantic phallic rockets in the space, it's a horror show. It really, really, truly is. And the ability that a few wealthy billionaires have to, and cryptocurrency and all those things, it's horrible. But for example, and it's not like I don't know how to fix these things, I'm an English professor, but for example, many women from other countries, for example, Palestinian women, are using Twitter in order to speak to each other and organize, because it's the one place where they can talk to each other. And that is also true. And of course, there's accessibility issues depending on the country you're in, but it is also true that we can organize and speak to each other, that there are also spaces, even in this monstrous space, where we can amplify our message, where we can organize, where we can organize anonymously or in a way that's somewhat safer, or let people on the other side of the world know what's happening in a particular country. And I don't know if that's going to fix anything, but in terms of power, we do have at least the power to be heard by those who are listening at a global scale that I think didn't exist before. I think at least there's that. I don't think we're going to do anything about capitalist billionaire monsters. I think that's there's not a lot we can do, but we can at least speak to each other.
Well, until they get in a room together and actually measure each other's penises and realise whose has got the biggest, we'll never get past that. So yeah.
I don't think they have any penises at all. It's just always
yeah. I mean,
just overcompensation.
yeah. Oh, it's so ugly.
I would say, if I may, I think that any technology and whole internet culture is as if so many other things in our life throughout the history. It can do good, it can do bad, it can be depending how we're using it. Certain, chemical components, plants or whatever, can be both a medicine or a poison. And it's kind of the same thing, that it depends how we're using it. And I feel like we love to, as people, point out all the worst things about technology and the internet, how unsafe it is, how kids these days do nothing but sit on their phones, etc., etc. But we like to kind of put the guilt on the technology itself, on the internet for existing, rather than on people who use it for a bad thing. Some people will use internet, of course, as a kind of to shield themselves for that anonymity to do bad. But there's still a lot of people. I feel like there's a lot of in fiction. There's a lot of this futuristic dystopian visions where the world, kind of, we as people still exist, etc., but somehow we're completely washed out of any emotions, empathy, etc., and we are kind of robots in this bad feeling, emotionless sense. But there's still so many proof in the world that people are full of empathy, and if they can find a way to use something for good, there will be people who will try to do that. And I think that's quite often, in the kind of everyday discussion of about internet and technology.
Yeah.
Yes, this issue, returning to the cyborgness, this issue of the singularity remains open. There will be a point where our minds, our thought will take exactly with a machine. That is, of course, a huge problem, solution, issue, whatever. Still to be researched as well. Researchers are beginning on the theme, but maybe it is empathy, maybe it is emotion that heart of our human existence that a cyborg, even though as maybe we are looking at the cyborg as a binary other than ourselves, which is Shannon has a different position on that, which is something that divide us, or as a Blade Runner solution to the test. You're understanding who is empathic, that of course is open to fabulation, to fantasy, etc.
And the fact that that empathy has come up again, we're in this. It's really. It's been really interesting how within the course that we've come from, we've continually returned, no matter what the subject's been. Empathy seems to be this thing that keeps coming up across different areas within the project course, the course that this project's come from. We set up an empathy lab as part of a practice in the last part of this semester to kind of explore further where we use empathy within the world. And the fact that it's come up within this conversation now is really interesting. And I wonder if this conversation of empathy has come up because of the pandemic, because we've now become more socially engaged through online experiences, and how everyone in university has struggled massively to change jobs into like teaching online, studying online, and having all of these kind of social experiences. We've all been forced onto that, and then realizing that actually everybody's having a really hard time and no one can really get that balance of what's happening. So I don't know, I don't really know how much anyone thought about empathy beforehand. Like, we all like to think we're quite empathic creatures, I think, to a certain extent, but are we only thinking more about empathy now because the pandemic's happened, or is this something that's just kind of always been there? Yeah, that's kind of interesting with it.
I think it's always been there, but maybe in the past it's been seen as a weakness, as opposed as something that you can build strength on. And I think just because we've had a collective catastrophe on such a global scale, that we've all realized that we have to be empathetic. And that's extended to our neighbour, to our local, to the organisations that help us facilitate empathy. And I think we just get frustrated when the powers that be and the governance that we actually elect to be our electorate don't have that empathy. And capitalism, patriarchy doesn't seem to have empathy, but we're all desperate for it to have it, I think. Go on, yeah.
I've heard it said that serial killers have terrific empathy because they have the ability to anticipate pain and fear in their victims. So empathy, should we understand, isn't necessarily a virtue. It can also be a terrible thing. I think politicians actually are terrifically empathetic. The way they manipulate people, cajole people, create fear through the media. Terrifically empathetic people. They know exactly what they're doing. They can anticipate the reactions of the public if they're manipulated in certain ways. So I think empathy should be used carefully. It can be misconstrued. It probably has a double meaning. We all know it as good generally, but it's worth considering that empathy is just a word, and it can be.
But I think it's become I think it's the first time we've experienced since World War II mass population empathy, in the sense of what we would like empathy to be. That's what I feel. Global I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to have not experienced it before. Like, I've not been through a world war. I imagine there was immense feeling of empathy. I don't know. It's just.
And I share thoughts. First of all, one thing that I'm thinking about, following what Lee just shared, is the idea that maybe we are like stuck with empathy, but maybe we need to move into compassion as a framework of thinking about what we're actually pointing to. And then to also kind of point to other discourses, because Frankie, you asked, you don't know whether those discourses existed before the pandemic or not, but there is really interesting, like maybe 2 or 3 years before the pandemic, one of the most like contagious discussions around VR technologies was in relationship to empathy. And in relationship, there was a whole discourse mainly coming in from corporate facilitators of VR or technology having that potential of creating empathy or even substituting the human empathy through those kind of virtual experiences. So there were examples of like VR and animation creations that were really directed at the creation of empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, actually going through that journey. And on the other hand, from VR creators, there was a real strong kind of rejection of that, kind of trying to think about empathy through that prism of VR. So the word empathy was kind of already floating about in criticism around technology. And just as Lee said, it can be a double-edged sword, because it really depends
where do you look, which perspective you look at it from, and how you use empathy and for what. And
I think it's really overused now. It's used far too much. I think compassion is a much more appropriate word for what we all mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily empathy.
I mean, empathy is a condition for compassion, but then maybe there is a step further to be made in that emotional realm.
Yeah, and it's one of those, to go back to Shannon's text. There's a really interesting section of the text, which is a little an interview that Shannon. And I hope you don't mind if I read this section, Shannon. It's between an interaction between three individuals. And it's about, I suppose, for me, it was one of those things that triggered this idea of emotion in these identities and how we interact with each other. So, thank you. Shade's first experiment was traumatic. When the boy she was playing with began to play more roughly than she felt comfortable with, she found herself more deeply upset by the scene than her assumptions about VR's safety and distance had led her to anticipate. She abruptly left for her own room, but she was too unsettled by the intensity of the experience to simply disconnect. A woman who had been involved in the scene became concerned and paged her. Paging means for players who are not in the same room to communicate with each other, and offered to ask a lesbian friend of hers to join Shade and talk through her upset. The friend Trina was very sympathetic and understanding, and after a fairly short time, Shade became intimately involved with her. Their involvement included S&M roleplay, which she felt was much safer with a woman. When after several weeks of intense sexual encounters, Trina confessed to being male in real life, and Shade was furious. When she considered that all the people involved in the original scene knew each other well and were all playing along in the deception, her sense of betrayal was so deep that it was several weeks before she felt she could trust anybody she met virtually again. According to Shade, the boy's rationale for passing as lesbian was apparently to help women, to keep them safe from other men who might have hurt them. I can't say what his actual intentions were. He's no longer around to ask. The incident happened several years ago, and Trina has since either left Landamu or as sometimes occurs when somebody becomes visibly unpopular, has assumed another identity. Possibly this group of boys was simply experimenting with role-playing and had no idea if their actions would be of any emotional consequence. For some participants, never seeing the face of whoever they were dealing with in VR somehow translates to them to not having to be responsible for their actions. In any case, Shade's story is by no means the only incident of genuine emotional pain incurred when newcomers naively believed to be. I can't read that again. Shade's story is by no means the only incident of genuine emotional pain incurred in what newcomers naively believed to be an environment divorced from reality. I think I wanted to know what anyone thought about that particular interaction, and maybe actually I could pass out over to Shannon to see how she kind of reflects on that now.
One of the things that, and I don't know if it's still prevalent, probably, but in the early internet, and remember this was before everybody was on the internet, there were only a few of us, mostly from engineers, a few academics. AOL hadn't quite happened yet, and the Great Flood in 94, 95 of the general public. So I think people really did not understand the nature of this space. What pre-existed the space was BDSs, the alt.dot forums, and people did on the forums, the BDSs, use some of the spaces to be outrageous, to be really, really twisted, to be sadistic, in a way that was understood mostly by most of the players, who were mostly white guys, to be acting out, to be playful, to be not entirely serious. Things changed when more women, more people of color, more out queer people began to migrate into these previously exclusive spaces. There was still a kind of an ethos of detachment and disconnection, of being somebody online that you weren't in real life. And there really was a fundamental misunderstanding that we're talking to real human beings. And I think people were playing a different game. But I see that now also with Gamergate, with doxing, with the kind of harassment that particularly women and people of color endure online. And it's still a form of sociopathy where people are playing different games and come to the internet with different intentions. I think there's still a particular, what I was going to say is that the more outrageous of the forums, the alt.net forums, evolved into 4chan and 8chan, which has now come to us as QAnon. Those worst tendencies have persisted, surfaced into the real world, and are now shaping policy, at least in my country, in some horrific ways. And it was those same boys playing around because nobody told them they couldn't. There were no boundaries and no real controls over their behavior. There was that set of people, and they've gotten worse. And they do affect our lives online. There's another set of people, the rest of us, who realize that we're talking to other human beings online. We've never separated emotionally ourselves. Certainly we might play roles or play with aspects of ourselves. It's always been a play space too, and a space to expand oneself. But there are these fundamentally different understandings of what we're doing there, and also who we are talking to, and that there's other human beings. I think obviously during the pandemic, all of humanity has been forced to be online in different ways. There's many more people. It's a much more natural part of life than it was back then. So we're kind of recognizing that there are in fact real people on the internet. But the sociopathic, unconstrained tendencies have certainly persisted. And I think what that story was about is the grain of that. I think if a lot of that had been handled better back then, we might not be seeing some of the problems now. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I don't know, that story that you just read, Frankie, it reminds me of what's happening, like dynamics in dating websites in places like this, where women are constantly being bombarded with, dick pics and things like that. And I don't think that it is very different in that sense, maybe even became worse. It's almost like this maybe space that we can take online from reality, like, there will be the distance that will not allow the person to react physically or immediately to what you do. You can always disappear, you can always block, that give people a lot of audacity to kind of abuse others in very cynical ways, I think, online still. And I think that one of the discussions that we've had earlier on in Neon, virtual roundtable discussions, constantly kind of trying to think how the internet could become a safe space for women in the most general sense, because it seems to be still very much controlled by logics that are not really giving space for those identities when we look at the kind of mainstream social media networks that we're all using. So yeah, just bringing that up.
It's very, very true. Does anyone else got anything to add? And we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, we have a comment about back to empathy. So yeah, it's by Amy. Yes, I think these empathetic self-made communities have always existed, but now companies are thinking about more since the pandemic happened, so they can capitalize on it. And then continuing, the conversation of empathy in big tech are similar to all kinds of corporate advertisement, which are now driven by social justice and feminism. They refer to the Gillette Men campaign about holding the friends accountable for misogyny, or woman razor ads that talk about body hair being a choice rather than a shameful thing. It's just because they have picked up as a potentially profitable space where it wasn't before. So it's slightly less optimistic side on the theme. While Shannon refers to vaccination as an empathy practice, which is quite far from the individualistic position of not having a vaccine or whatever.
Last week, I was told by the TV to be green by Amazon. I was so annoyed that this was allowed to be on my TV. Amazon, they put a feature length, one of these feature length horrible adverts. Be green, be green, be green. Amazon. I'm like,
Oh God.
how?
Oh no.
How the hell are we supposed to fight something like that? Because, I know, just the whole conversation, I always kind of think of my mum and dad, think of me, and then think of my 14-year-old daughter and how different those kind of. My mum and dad would be, oh great, Amazon are
I
green.
was just thinking my mum was saying that. It's exactly
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah. Oh, Amazon's
Order more.
green. Yeah, let's order more. I'm like, what? No, we can't do this. And Amelie's just my daughter's just in a kind of multifaceted digital. Don't give a hoo-ha what society thinks anymore. It's like, just fighting that engine is. I'm tired.
But it's all right. Bezos has put $2 billion aside to
Oh,
go into
cool.
the Bezos Environmental Fund.
Honestly, I think he's just getting his big dick rocket and fly to Mars and leave us all alone.
So last question
Yeah.
before
Yeah.
opening maybe for some curiosities from questions or contributes by both dimensions of audience, the 2D and the 3D.
Yeah.
Just kidding. So we've been talking about access, we've been talking about bias, we've been talking about the cyborg as a queer, but how do you think the metaphor of the cyborg, if that is a metaphor, or is it a reality that becomes truth, can open up a space for being queer or for queer expression? Does it relate somehow to tackling those gender gaps or those class gaps or those race gaps or country gaps that affect the access to information or to, in general, to role models, for example? Or is it something more related to an introvert research?
I think, and somebody said earlier, which really struck me, the cyborg as metaphor gives us a representation or a possibility of gender that is not so firmly rooted in biological bodies. And there really is a difference between somebody looking at me on the street and my very feminine body, or the ways that I must necessarily either be perceived as feminine or sometimes professionally present as feminine, or present in ways that, as a friend of mine put it when we were talking about this, in ways that might reduce risk to my female person walking down the street. That's a constant consideration, is being a female self. And constantly measuring safety, constantly measuring the way that I am perceived, the way I'm received, how seriously I am taken in a professional space, or whether I exist at all in space, depending on one's appearance or age or size, all of those things, which are just an everyday part of life. So cyborgness as metaphor allows for, I think, a lot more fluidity, a lot more self-fashioning from a different theoretical angle there. but the possibility of the self being extensible. And if we mentioned the other day about makeup as a technology, for example, and an idea of extending and one's gender being extensible through makeup, through the clothes you put on and take off, which is true. Being a self online or being a machinic self extends myself as another example. And this we haven't discussed about the literal relationship between human and machine. When I ride my motorcycle, I become my machine. There's not, I am motorcycle. It is me. I feel my bones are it's a really visceral experience for me, and it's very hard to explain. I tell people I'm motosexual, but which is true. It is an amazing feeling for me to feel that engine is my heart and my ribs, and that engine are the same. That when I move on the road, the machine moves with me in a way that I don't, not literally transcends the human, but affectively certainly. And I find that state of being incredibly powerful and incredibly interesting, and very much beyond gender. I mean, motorcycles might be associated with masculinity, but then I am a moto self, not feminine or masculine, and very, very, very energized. And I don't mean erotic in the grossest way, but the deep interconnection between myself and something that is not even human. It is a really fascinating condition for me.
Thank you very much. We're coming to this point where we're running out of time. So we wanted to return to we wanted to basically ask if anyone in the room or anyone online or Shannon have any more questions that you want to kind of contribute to the conversation. But while you're thinking about that, we'd love to return to the opening question of like thinking about your own identity again and how you see it now. If anything's changed in the last couple of hours, if you still feel the same. And then maybe for those who are based in Dundee, what about Dundee's virtual identity? How do you feel about the city? How would that be represented online or in a virtual entity? Anyone's got any questions? Any responses? Anything online?
I think what you just said, Frankie, is really interesting. We haven't had the chance, but it really connects to what Shannon was just sharing, right? So if we can think about Dundee as having an identity that can be performed online, that kind of animation maybe of inanimate objects, of abstract concepts, of like this objectification of those abstract objects, maybe this is something to reckon when thinking about cyborg psychology, which I think is really interesting in that.
How would you see what you were just asking there as visitors?
I have no idea. I have two spaces, my hotel and this gallery.
But you said earlier you felt the energy, that you felt people were friendly and open.
Very open. That's true.
Yeah. So how would that be represented then?
We had that yesterday, right? It was an old. Where was that? An old man with Dundee accent. When we ask people what is AI.
I don't know. Like visually, I don't know, but which is funny considering I'm quite a visual person. But I can definitely there's an emotion that's a big, open, friendly, funny kind of entity. There's humor behind it. There's honesty and kindness all in that kind of that's how I would see Dundee as a kind of virtual entity, I suppose, more than a I think that's how I would have an AI probably be quite.
For me, I would say, as having a bit of experience with Dundee, obviously my focus is on artistic and cultural, but I always kind of considered Neon and Creative Dundee as the kind of virtual identity of Dundee. For example, Creative Dundee It kind of takes all of those little things, events, people, etc., who are based in in the real life city, in physical, and kind of bringing them together virtually into something that kind of creates the arts and culture of Dundee. That's kind of my personal experience with it.
We have a comment from online, from Alison. This conversation has got me thinking about shifting relationships between public and private selves and spaces. My online identity is based on the idea that I need to protect myself, driven not by play, but by fear of danger. I think I haven't quite grasped it until now, but I'm a natural introvert. Thank you, Alison. Yeah, there's definitely this protect and or risk dimension of being in a you're welcome, in an environment which is unknown, after all, as everything that gravitates, everything that lives in the digital realm is fundamentally an unknown. As we have read the story of this betrayal, this story of Shade and Trina. So it is true that there is a risk dimension, and it is true. But on the other hand, I think also that many times, as was mentioned before, especially again, I think that filtering information becomes a tool for expression, or for slowly discovering that unknown. I'm using a terrible metaphor. I mean, it's a metaphor coming from a field of. But let's talk about the Johari window, not about the Warfield metaphor. So there is a space of possibility of opening, which is probably through the internet, more and more open, little by little, because probably there is a mechanism, I think, of double message, that you leave a message, you make a message, leave yourself, and then somewhat when it returns back through a reaction, it gives you time, it gives you space to rethink yourself and to present again yourself maybe differently, with less fear of being judged. So I think that there is the other side, which does allow individuals to create public spaces, which empowers. This was brought up by others. I'm also a natural optimist. Yeah, there is this possibility of creating platforms, of opening possibilities to a wider audience. It's more or less.
Like
Neon's festival, Neon's project.
Can I share that Alison's comment actually made me think that throughout this conversation, maybe it's a blissful thing and maybe I shouldn't bring that up, but I think it's almost impossible to think about online identity without delving into privacy issues and what Shoshana Zuboff is speaking about, the surveillance capitalism, and the fact that we expose ourselves online in radical ways, and that because it is documented and recorded and followed upon and read and interpreted and thrown back into our faces in different ways, there is this sense of really deep vulnerability, especially right now, in relationship to how those systems affect exactly those kind of divisions between private and public spaces, between our right to maintain secrets. And we know that social media works as a kind of evidence. Of course, it's not yet valid as evidence in court, but we still use social networks, and we've seen many cases where exposing ourselves in social networks can compromise, for example, job opportunities, social opportunities, etc. So I think that there is something quite real that Alison brings in, that many times the identity that we present online tries to somehow escape those logics. And much of our interest in engaging online is to kind of play with this dynamic without exposing ourselves too much.
Sorry.
No. I just, when you talk about it made me think of the whole. It's a bigger conversation, for definitely not for another time. But the whole right to be forgotten because it's such a huge problem. Like, okay, we'll only give, we put out this information, but trying to like be like, oh, I really wish I didn't have any of my pictures from my like first and second year of university on Facebook. But in more serious terms, like, yeah, to be able to be like, when you die, if someone makes the choice to say, I want everything of my history to not be on the internet anymore. That's part of my last will and testament, but there's still the level of like discussion going on about it. Like, how do you remove someone's entire identity? How do you can't? It's impossible.
There are companies that do that, but it costs a lot of money, which again brings us back to the digital divide and how much control we have over ourselves and identity online are very much dependent, and maybe bringing in also the notions of intersectionality, right? It really is dependent on our socioeconomical background and our access to technology, to literacies. So there is this whole thing that we haven't spoken about. I think it's very much at the heart of the Young Festival this year. Maybe just to remind us why we find so much comfort in thinking about the 90s and the anonymous internet that allowed us those freedoms to play.
I think I said that to you, didn't I?
Yeah. But there's still such a massive divide in terms of digital accessibility. We're very privileged, like Shannon says, we can have an internet connection, we can have a phone, we can have a device, and yet the people live their lives without all of this. Whether giving more accessibility is a good thing, or it's maybe let's just keep a few of those people that are great without it. so when somebody pulls the plug, we can still survive. But I had a really bizarre experience a few years ago when I was diagnosed with something, and it was the first 3 weeks of getting diagnosed. It could have been cancer. So I was in the hospital trying my best to download myself digitally, because I thought if I go away, my husband would not have a clue how to access anything. And we didn't have photographs. I've got no printed photographs. So I printed what was must have been thousands of photographs from my hospital bed into the physical world. And it was overwhelming, because I'm everywhere. When you start looking, you're everywhere. If you've been on the internet since the internet, you're everywhere. And it's, but that's my choice, but it's not my family's choice. So, who controls that after I've gone? That my Facebook account will still be there and people still messaging me, but my husband and my daughter, I don't own anything, so I can't, and they don't own it. It was just a kind of bizarre situation to be in. I mean, luckily it wasn't that. I'm still here. It was great. That's got sorted. But it's kind of actually trying to untangle yourself. I would suggest it as an exercise to everybody. Just take an hour to try and untangle yourself from the internet or the digital world. It's horrific. It's horrific.
Yeah.
Emmy referred to we have an integral right to die, and technology is starting to infringe that, in my opinion. Not just referring to social media, but for example, how many dead actors have acted in films post-mortem, so reconstruction, even not only just keeping the data, but using them as
maybe speaks to another potentiality of the cyborg, right? Because the fantasy of the cyborg is to download a human brain into a machine that will live forever. And I think that right to die is a really interesting one when we really, if we really are to adopt this kind of discourses around cyborgisms.
Okay, thank you very much for having been with us. I've been glad to have you, Shannon, here, of course. Very glad to have our guests, our friends from here and there.